Let's start with the less frightening wanted killers and gradually move on to those feared by law enforcement and still at large. Let's go. 7. The alphabet killer. You probably thought this killer carved letters from the alphabet on the bodies of his victims. Listen further. The alphabet killer is linked to 3 confirmed crimes committed in New York State in the early 1970s. The victims of the alphabet killer were young girls whose initials matched the first letter of their city, hence the nickname. A significant factor was the killer hunting his victims with a cat. Here you might wonder why the hell he took a cat with him. Most likely, it was his only friend, and he took her along just to feel like he was working as a team. Unfortunately, she was a mediocre partner, leaving too much evidence like cat fur. Clumps of fur were found on the bodies and clothes of the victims. For a long time, the deceased Dennis Termini was considered a suspect, but in 2007, he was acquitted, and the real criminal, as you understand, remained at large. 6. The freeway phantom. This is a mysterious guy who raped and killed 6 young girls. All the Phantom's victims were African-American girls aged 10 to 18. He ended their lives in a classic way, by strangling the victim. The freeway Phantom's first strike was on April 25, 1971. 13-year-old Carol, at the request of her older sister, went to the store for groceries and never returned home. It is assumed that kidnapped Carol was already on her way back, as her body was found 6 days later on the roadside embankment. But the Phantom got his nickname thanks to the 4th victim, because the girl's body was found on the shoulder of the freeway. The main clues for detectives were green carpet fibers found on the bodies of 5 victims and a sample of sperm extracted from one of the bodies. Unfortunately, this was not enough. The freeway Phantom was never caught. 5. Dr. No. This guy killed at least 9 girls and women in Ohio in the 1980s. He chose prostitutes in the parking lot as his victims. At first, he took off their underwear and shoes, which in principle cannot be called a crime, right? However, after that, Dr. No caused cranial brain injuries to bewildered ladies and began to strangle, which became the cause of death. Sometimes the killer literally beat them to half-death before strangling them. Dr. No's identity is still unknown, and his murders are attributed to several killers. It is still not known for sure where he is and whether he is alive. Number 4. The New Orleans lumberjack. This guy needs attention. He brought horror to the whole country, although he did not act as long as other serial killers, just over a year, from May 1918 to October 1919. The lumberjack attacked his victims with an axe. The crime started suddenly and ended just as unexpectedly. The police never found the maniac who terrorized the entire county. The lumberjack's bloodthirstiness was most striking. Among his victims were a pregnant woman and a child chopped right in the arms of his mother. But just the fear of others was not enough for the lumberjack. So he wrote letters about himself to the newspapers. In them, he called himself not a man, but a demon from hell, and promised that there would be more murders. But listen to what he did next. With his most famous letter, the lumberjack made the whole city do what he wanted. On March 13th, 1919, he wrote that on March 19th, after midnight, there would be a new murder. The only people the lumberjack promised not to touch were those who would be listening to jazz at that time. On March 19th, all entertainment venues were crowded, and professionals and amateurs played jazz right on the street. No murders occurred that night. However, shortly before that, the lumberjack committed his most terrible crime. On the night of March 10th, 1919, neighbors heard screams in the home of immigrant laborer Charles Cordemelly. When neighbors rushed to help, they saw Charles and his wounded wife Rosie kneeling in a pool of blood. She held in her hands the 2-year-old daughter Mary, killed by the lumberjack. You're right, this maniac lived almost 100 years ago and is most likely already dead. But imagine what it was like for all those people to live, knowing that this person was still free, at liberty. 3. Skid Row Stabber. The series of murders began on the morning of October 23, 1978. The killer chose predominantly homeless people as victims, whose bodies he then dumped in the alleys of various streets not far from each other. A dubious method of combating homelessness, isn't it? The crimes occurred with frightening regularity. October 29th, October 30th, November 4th, November 9th, November 11th, November 12th, 2 victims, November 17th, November 23rd, And the last murder took place on January 21st, 1979. All victims were brutally stabbed with a knife, so the killer immediately received the nickname Skid Row Butcher. It seemed that at one point the killer was identified and even caught, but the years of detention of the main suspect were called the result of a judicial error. But he himself did not find out about it. Several months before this trial, Maxwell suffered a heart attack and was in a coma. He died in April 2019 and never learned of his acquittal. The case cooled down, but the real maniac remained at large. 2. Zodiac. This cruel and mysterious maniac operated in the USA and San Francisco in the late 60s. All his messages addressed to the police contained cryptograms, thanks to which the Zodiac received his nickname. However, over the entire investigation, cryptographers were able to read only one of his bloody letters. Officially, the Zodiac is credited with 5 victims, 2 of whom survived after the attack. The criminal himself wrote that he killed as many as 37 people. He operated with a pistol or a knife. He often shot beloved couples, and one of his victims, a young girl, was found with numerous stab wounds. 1. Monster and Colombian maniac. Pedro Alonzo Lopez, although caught by the police, spent only 16 years in prison and then was released. This is despite his sincere confessions that the blood of more than 300 girls was baked on the hands of the killer. He strangled them to death and practiced necrophilia on their lifeless bodies, and later hid them in the ground. Lopez was released from the psychiatric center in 1998 because he was considered healthy. There, he confessed that he would definitely continue to kill because it was his mission, and yet he was really released. Interpol is still looking for him, but his whereabouts are unknown. So Lopez can be counted as caught but fairly punished. Hardly. In my opinion, this is the most flagrant case from this list. How could you manage to take away so many lives and still go unpunished? Don't forget to subscribe since you've watched to this moment, and share your thoughts on this in the comments.